You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Campus Podcast with me, Miranda Prynne, newly returned from maternity leave and thrilled to be back in the hot seat as the new campus editor.
And me, Eliza Compton, Deputy Editor of Campus.
So today we're discussing what the UK general election on July 4th might mean for higher education, which has been taking a battering politically in recent months, or some would say years. Under the incumbent Conservative government, there have been threatened clampdowns on international student numbers. There are plans to close supposed low-quality Mickey Mouse courses, the pitching of degrees against apprenticeships, with the rhetoric very much in favour of the latter. And, of course, continued freezes on tuition fees, which are making university budgets tighter and tighter and tighter. But if the polls are to be believed, we will be welcoming in a Labour government on July 5th. So, could this general election offer some rays of hope for the beleaguered sector? Eliza, before we launch into our interviews, I feel we should provide a quick summary of the main parties' manifesto pledges relating to higher education. So do you want to start us off with Labour?
Yeah, of course. Yes, we've now heard from all the major parties. I have cribbed here from the Higher Education Policy Institute, which has helpfully summarised each party's proposals regarding higher education. Labor's pledges include acting to create a secure sector for HE and improve access. They're also pledging to replace short-term R&D funding with 10-year budgets and working with universities to support spin-outs and developing a post-16 skills strategy. I noted Keir Starmer's focus on skills at their launch today, actually.
Yeah, great. The Conservative key pledges, some of which I've already touched on, are to raise public research and development spending to 22 billion a year from the current level of 20 billion, to maintain R&D tax reliefs. They have also talked about investing in sort of compute clusters with a focus on AI research. Another of their big pledges is to create 100,000 apprenticeships, that's by 2029, and of course the scrapping of 130,000 low-quality or supposed low-quality degrees. We should probably also briefly mention that the Liberal Democrats have a number of promises in place. Key ones are around pushing for greater R&D spending and continued participation in Horizon Europe. And notably, they would also reinstate student maintenance grants. So, what in real terms might all this mean? And how can higher education leaders seize this moment of political upheaval to lobby for greater support for universities in Westminster? I spoke to Nick Hillman, Director of the Higher Education Policy Institute, and a former Chief of Staff to David Willetts when he was Minister for Universities and Science. So someone who understands the workings of Whitehall more than most. Hi, Nick. How long is it that you have been closely following the kind of undulations of higher education policy in the UK now?
Well, a long time, a good at least 15 years. I came back to work for David Willetts because I'd worked for him previously when he was the Shadow Higher Education Minister in autumn 2007, I think it was. So, yeah, more than 15 years, and been focusing almost exclusively on higher education ever since then. So I've seen some changes.
Well, you're the ideal person to discuss what may be in store for higher education with the election looming. It's something that anyone engaged with UK higher education is well aware of, that the worries around funding. We've had a decade almost of near static tuition fees, which in real terms represents a really big loss of revenue for universities. And of course, now international student numbers are being eroded. So there are a lot of warnings being thrown around about the growing crisis in UK higher education. Yet politicians do seem fairly resolutely uninterested in doing anything, certainly in terms of finances, to help the sector. So In your view, what can higher education leaders do to try and kind of prove universities' wider value or societal worth to policymakers and shake off the perception that they are elite and perhaps only bring benefit to a few?
Yeah, so I mean, I certainly recognise the picture you're painting in your question of underfunded universities. I would add, of course, underfunded students as well. Maintenance support has not gone up either, and students are really struggling sometimes to pay their rent, not so much the fees that are covered by the loans. And the maintenance loans are just not enough. Now, what can universities do to engage policymakers? I mean, first of all, I think universities are sort of at the sore end of the political cycle because politicians don't want to make commitments that could mean they fall into difficult holes, spending black holes or whatever in the heat of an election campaign. But at least so far, politicians are also not making blunt hostages to fortune. They're not saying things like, "We'll never increase fees ever again" or anything like that. But the quickest answer to your question is, they need to engage policymakers, and an election campaign is a really good moment to do that. Every university in the country should be hosting election hustings for their local candidates and getting guest students and staff, but also people from the local community onto campus to take part in, great democratic endeavour that an election is. The other thing they can do, of course, is really focus on the benefits that a university brings to a region, not necessarily just the town or city it's based in, the whole region where a university is. And very often the mistake universities make is they only talk, for example, to the MP that actually represents that university. But I mean, take part of England like East Anglia. Well, in East Anglia, most higher education is done in Cambridge and Norwich, some in Peterborough as well. But you shouldn't, if you're a higher education institution in East Anglia, only be talking to the MPs for Cambridge or Norwich or Peterborough. You should be talking to every single member of parliament for East Anglia, because those higher education institutions in East Anglia benefit the whole of East Anglia. And they really need to reach out to everybody. And they should also, some of it, by the way, is really basic stuff. Every university in the country should have one side of A4 smart infographics with all their key data that they should literally thrust into the hand of every policymaker they ever meet. Cambridge used to have a very good A4 sheet that did exactly that, for example. So some of it's not rocket science. It's just repeating the messages over and over and over again about the economic and social and regional contributions that universities make.
Yeah, so a kind of benefits roundup, really simplifying it in a quick fire way to demonstrate the wider benefits.
Yes, and of course, as soon as you do that, people go, "Oh, why you're only talking numbers?" University is about so much more than economics and economic contribution. And of course, they're right. But first of all, politicians like numbers; they like something they can get their teeth into. And secondly, talking about the economic contribution a university makes to an area doesn't stop you from talking about all the other benefits as well. Whether it's supporting cultural institutions, or employing lots of people locally, or sort of supporting local employers, doesn't stop you from doing all that as well.
Yeah, it just gives the politicians something tangible to work with.
Yeah, because I mean, after the general election is when the real work starts, of course, with the next spending review and how much will each government department get for the next 3 or 4 years. Most people think if Labour win, and the polls suggest they will, then we'll have a sort of quick short-term funding settlement for the next year for 25, 26. But then they'll really get into deep work on a spending review for the next 3 or 4 years after that, and exactly how much each government department should get to spend on its priorities in the next 3 or 4 years. And that's, we need universities to be front and centre of that conversation.
Yeah, and representing it as an investment rather than a cost.
Yeah, yes, that's absolutely right. But of course, education is also, as well as an investment, it's also a consumer good that people enjoy and people want to have more of, and they feel they are more personally fulfilled as a result of it. And one of the reasons I get so annoyed when I read in the papers is too many people go to university and we should limit how many people go to university is actually, even though people now have to cover a lot of the costs of higher education themselves, they still go on buying it because they recognize its value to them personally, even if it's not going to make them millionaires. it allows them to have a fulfilling and rewarding career. And they generally, people, while they're students, really enjoy their life as students as well. And they learn a lot about themselves. And there are all sorts of benefits. We know very, very clearly that if you're a graduate, the benefits in terms of health, in terms of your motivation in life, even things like life expectancy are longer among graduates than people who could have gone to university that wanted to but chose not to. So the benefits are enormous to the individual as well as to the country and society.
Yeah, I've seen it pointed out more than once that often the people that argue for student number caps would still expect anyone within their family to go to university. So that's, I think there's a truism there that is quite telling.
I think it's even worse than that. I mean, what you say is correct. It's also that the people who are most in favour of student number caps are very often graduates themselves. And as you say, still want their own children to go, but they're not that keen on other people's families having all those benefits. And, in a way on paper, that's logical because it means they stay ahead of everybody else in the labour market. They've got a degree when other people can't. But I don't think any of us who work in education should be relaxed about the idea that in future fewer people will be able to access education. Certainly what motivates me is I'm an expansionist. I want as many people to have as much education as possible.
Moving on to what a future government can potentially do. Obviously, we do have fairly good insight into Tory policy based on just what's been going on for the last few years. But certainly Labour have remained fairly quiet with any real detail as to their plans. I think we can be relatively confident the next government is either going to be Conservative or Labour. And as you say, most of the polls would tell us that it is likely to be Labour. So working on that basis and taking into account the very tight budgetary constraints with which any future government is going to be working, and the supposed political expediency. I know most in Westminster clearly think it's not politically palatable right now to offer further funding to universities. So taking all of those quite major challenges into account, what do you think a future government could realistically do that would actually bring some real benefits to UK higher education right now?
Yeah, so I mean, I do sort of share the frustration that's hinted at in your question that we don't know more about what the likely incoming Labour government would do in relation to higher education. But there are some hints. So there is one part of the UK where Labour have been in power for a very long time, which is Wales. And higher education, teaching and learning, at least, not research, is largely devolved. And the Welsh Labour government, for a while in coalition with the Welsh Lib Dems, have done some things that are really quite different to England and the rest of the UK. So, for example, they have more generous maintenance support for students. They've actually just put up tuition fees in Wales, only up to the English level, but nonetheless, it shows that tuition fee rises are not completely off the table with a Labour government. And they've also got a slightly more progressive student loan repayment phase after you've graduated. So the Welsh system is really quite different to the English system and has been put in place by a Labour government. I think the other thing where we might see a real extra focus is on sort of regional role that universities play as employers, as supporters of local employers, and indeed as institutions that do research, and also as institutions that might work with other educational institutions in the area, whether it's FE colleges or schools. And so we might see sort of a bit more joined upness, if that's a term. But equally, I don't think anybody should be too relaxed or too optimistic. There are other things that could happen potentially under a left-wing government that people may not realise. I mean, the first, for example, is higher education is going to be quite a long way down their priority list. The shadow education team seem to be much more focused on early years, also arguably more focused on school curricula than on higher education. And of course, you mentioned earlier on international students. Well, we might assume that a left of centre government would have a much more liberal migration regime. But if you look at progressive governments around the world, like in Australia, like in Canada, they're actually toughening up their student migration rules, just as we've been doing here in England under a Conservative government. Well, in the UK, I should say, under a Conservative government recently. So I think people think it's going to be nirvana on July the 5th. That's not going to happen. And also, change takes time. So even if Labour did have a fully formed programme, they might want to do a review, which will take even longer. It takes time to deliver change in government. Big higher education policies have at least a couple of years lead-in time normally.
What do you think would potentially be doable in a relatively short time frame, say sort of 2, 3, 4 years, that could offer some help to the sector? Because many in the sector are saying we're essentially in crisis and something needs to be done ASAP.
Yeah, I think there is a head of steam now behind a sort of two-stage process where you, in the early months of a new government, do some things to ameliorate the situation faced by institutions that are really in crisis. So that might be a bit of extra funding, a couple of 100 million, maybe a bit more, fed via the Office for Students into those institutions that are feeling the pain most. It could mean a bit of extra maintenance support for students. It could mean keeping the student loan system by and large as we've got it, but as I say, having slightly more progressive repayment rules. For example, in Wales, they've kept the real rate of interest on student loans, which means richer graduates in Wales will go on paying back for longer than in England. I don't actually see an appetite for a complete ripping up of the funding system we've got and replacing it with something completely different. We've had lots of major reviews of higher education in the UK, particularly England, in recent years. You've had, obviously, you had the Deering report back in the late 90s, then you had the Brown review, you had the Auger report. In Wales, you had the Diamond review, and they all end up saying that the best funding model is one where the costs are shared between graduates and the government or taxpayers. There is a growing interest in whether employers could do a bit more, whether employers can contribute to the system a bit more. We've published on that a HEPI, although there aren't any sort of models that are ready to implement immediately on that. And employers would say, well, they already pay a hell of a lot because they pay graduates more than non-graduates, so they're contributing into the system that way, and the graduates pay back. They pay corporation tax and all the other things employers have to cover, national insurance, employers' contributions, things like that. So I think employers would say, hang on, we are already contributing to the system. But that is another idea that's floating around that some people would like to unlock a bit more of a financial contribution from employers.
Just focusing on a potential Labour government, you've mentioned regionalisation. The other thing I wondered is, given that they haven't given away much about higher education specifically, what we do know is a bit of detail around, for instance, their industrial strategy with key areas where they really want to super boost growth. Do you think that has the potential to help if we, for instance, are needing to really accelerate our work towards net zero?
Yes.
Could that be a kind of beacon of light somewhere in this chain? Because obviously research and indeed teaching from an upskilling perspective are both absolutely fundamental to supercharging any area of the economy.
I would go even further than that. I would say that every really significant challenge facing our country, and obviously climate change is one, but there are others too, like low productivity and regional inequality. None of them can be fixed with our universities. At least none of them can be fixed quickly with our universities, both as employers and educators, but also, as you say, as researchers and delivering the key insights for tomorrow. So this is why I think many of us get so frustrated with the anti-university rhetoric that you so often hear, to be fair, not so much from the Labour Party, but because all those things that politicians constantly say have to be tackled, the really big challenges, cannot be tackled with our universities at the heart. And so I completely agree with you. And I think there's other pressures moving in that direction too. So, for example, the devolution of power away from Westminster towards combined authorities, for example, also pushes you towards thinking about, the economy on a regional basis and what educational institutions can do on a regional basis. I also think as well the funding pressures on universities could lead to a merger or two. And so again, you're more likely to be thinking regionally than one university in one town or city. But look, not everything drives in that direction because all these things cost money. And I think one thing I'm going to be really looking out for in the manifestos is what they say about university research, because at every recent general election before this one, it's been very clear what the party's going to say on research. They're just going to say, let's get research and development spending up to the OECD average of about 2.5%. And that's the goal. And Labour and Tories have said that in recent elections, as have the Lib Dems. But the Office for National Statistics, this is a dull but important point, recalculated how much we spend on R&D recently, and they've decided we've already spent actually slightly above the OECD average. So we've already hit the 2019 manifesto target without actually spending any more money. It's just we count it differently. So I'm going to be really intrigued when the manifestos come out. We've only really had the Lib Dem manifesto by the point at which I'm talking to you, of what they say about research. Are they going to commit to spend far more than we currently spend? Are they just going to say, well, now we've hit the OECD average, we're going to stick and spend our money on other things? And also, what's the balance going to be between blue skies and sort of more translational research? So you talked about research policy being used in industrial strategy. Well, that suggests to me you'll be spending maybe more of your research budget close, what they call close to market, on things that are inventions that are pretty much already there, or discoveries that are pretty much already there, not the blue sky stuff where you just don't know what direction it's going to take you in. And actually, both things are really important. We need to do both. And I think if we really want to compete with countries that spend a lot on R&D and have well-developed industrial strategies, we probably need to move beyond the OECD average of R&D spending of about 2.5%, close to 3%.
Yeah, the point that you need research to be happening that isn't necessarily immediately tied to economic business interest, I think is clearly proved by the work of the Oxford team during COVID, because of course they'd been working on research linked to what led to the vaccine for many, many years, which is what facilitated them being able to develop a vaccine very quickly. So, I mean, that's just one example, and there's many others.
The blue sky stuff is what ends up as the translational stuff later. I mean, I'm very proud to be a board member of my old university where I did my undergraduate studies, the University of Manchester, where, of course, they discovered graphene, which is now being used in all sorts of ways. The most phenomenal material, and that was found almost by luck, with no idea of what its application was going to be. So but the blue sky stuff really matters. But the problem is time horizons, because the blue sky discovery to be changing our lives might be a decade or two, whereas politicians tend to think 5 years or 10 years ahead. And so there's a bit of a mismatch there. But then we have the Haldane principle to try to protect us against some of that.
Yeah, of course. I did just wonder what your feeling was, because historically, research and higher education were very much tied together in one department. Do you think that it would be helpful to reorganise things so that research was once again a bit more closely tied to education rather than very much sitting in the Department for Business and Innovation? What's your thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to your question is yes, I think it would be helpful because, for example, think of all the debate we're currently having about cross subsidies from international student fees to research. Well, the international student fees are a policy issue that lands with one set of ministers, both in the Home Office and the Education Department. And then the question about how much we spend on research and how much of that comes from international student fees also lands on the table of the Science Minister and DSIT, the Science Department. And no one has a really joined up view of that. And, when I had the pleasure of working for David Willetts, he was the Minister for Universities and Science. And we could try to take an overall picture of, all the things the universities do pretty much together. On the other hand, I personally am someone who finds Whitehall reorganisations incredibly dull very often. And sometimes they're an excuse not to have good policy. You reorganise Whitehall, you're not quite sure what it is you want to do. But I actually think the case for it is strong. And what I would do is actually I'd remove the bits of higher education policy that are currently in the Department for Education, because I think universities currently play second fiddle to schools, far more people at school than the university, for example, and then put the teaching and learning functions of universities in with science and research, perhaps into DSIT or elsewhere in Whitehall.
Interesting. because that is something that is potentially doable without having to spend more, which seems to be the major sticking point on all those.
It's true, but it does take time as well.
Yeah.
It did work quite well, I think, when we were in government, when I was a special advisor, because higher education policy was in the business department, and the business department had two people around the cabinet table. In my time, Vince Cable and David Willetts, and it was seen as a pretty big player in Whitehall, and so I like that model. And you always have some boundaries, so you'll still have. The world would not be wonderful even if you made that change, because you'd still have some higher education policy being decided by the Home Office, for example. You'd still have a new gap between schools, which would be in the DfE, and universities, and wherever they end up. But I do think it would be better than the current arrangements we've got, yes.
Yeah. And then finally, I see you've done some analysis showing that holding the elections outside of university term time may actually amplify the influence of the student vote. I just wondered, what effect, if any, do you think student voters might have in this election?
Yeah, it's a really good question, this. And I think there's a lot of nonsense talked about student voters for many reasons. One of which is, of course, nearly every student voting in 2024 are completely different to the students who voted in 2019, because typically you don't stay at university for all that long. And so people talk about student voters as if they're a consistent group of voters, but we're talking about completely different human beings to the people who were student voters in 2019. The second bit of nonsense I think is spoken about, as you say, is that, when Rishi Sunak called the election for July the 4th, lots of people said, oh, he's disenfranchising students because they'll no longer be at their university. And of course, some students may be abroad on a holiday or whatever. But the polling is very, very clear. Students are much more likely to be registered to vote at their home holiday address than at their term time address. So actually, they're probably more likely to vote. And the other interesting thing is lots of students at term time are in big cities that frankly would probably be Labour seats even if they weren't there. Sheffield Central, which is one of the constituencies in the country with the biggest number of students, is probably at the moment a safe Labour seat even without lots of students there. We'll see on July the 4th. But and so what the students do if they vote Labour in bigger numbers than any other party is they just make a big Labour majority even bigger. Whereas if they dissipate around the country, their home address could be in a marginal seat that's very close. So in some instances, their voice will be louder, but harder to measure in an out-of-term election. On the other hand, there are some university seats that are close. So 2017, it's likely that Canterbury went Labour because the students were still hanging around Canterbury in 2017. And it was a very close result. Labour won in 2017, held it in 2019. So occasionally, I think there's a handful of seats where students have made a difference. The other thing, of course, is students to have an impact. Students have to be registered to vote. They have to turn up to vote. They have to remember to take the form of photo ID, and the options for them are smaller than the options for pensioners, for example. And then they have to be in a marginal seat for their voice to be heard, and probably vote differently to how that seat normally votes. So you have to have lots of things in place for a student vote to really count. But it also, I hope students vote in very large numbers. For example, there's good evidence that if you start voting young, you'll go on voting. I think I love that democratic tradition of turning up in person, putting my X alongside the box. I think it brings to life what being a citizen of a democratic country is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I get great satisfaction from going to the polling station and filling in those pieces of paper. I believe the research shows that there are more young people voting now than there would have been 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, and I think different elections have different motivating factors,
Yeah.
and this election could be an election, a watershed election, where the country turns a corner and takes a different course.
Yeah.
And so it could be something quite exciting for people to be involved with. I mean, the other thing is HEPI's former chair, Professor Sir Ivor Cruz, retired now, a great sort of political scientist. He said to me once, be careful of assuming students are just a block of voters that vote for student issues. He said, actually, most blocks of voters are not as different to other voters as people think. And it's true that if you look at polling of students, actually what motivates them to vote is rarely tuition fees or even maintenance support. It's all the same issues that motivate everybody else: the NHS, the environment, And they're not only voting on student issues. So we shouldn't think of students as being a sort of class apart or a completely separate group of voters.
Yeah, and of course they are very far from homogenous. All right, Nick, well, it's been great to talk to you. We shall wait and see what happens, I guess.
But thank you for having me on.
So, while Nick doesn't have a magic crystal ball in relation to future higher education policy, his point that we can learn from what Labour have done in Wales is a really interesting one. And he does clearly see an opportunity in Labour's industrial strategy. But he clearly thinks there is more work to be done on the part of university leaders to actually prove their value, or wider value, I should say, to MPs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Nick's point about the benefits that universities bring to regions and their contributions also to problems such as climate change is certainly something that universities should be singing from the rooftops, as well as making the most of all the outreach possibilities that come their way. In listening to Nick's interview, Miranda, I also had to look up graphene, which he mentioned as an example of research with unexpected uses, which is such an important thing to remember when we're thinking about R&D budgets and the need to keep pace with the rest of the industrial world. Graphene's the world's thinnest material, I discovered. It's just an atom thick. And its biomedical applications are many, but it also can be used in electronics, membranes and sensors.
Yeah, amazing stuff.
It really is. I spoke to Diana Beach, who is the CEO of London Higher, which represents more than 50 institutions across the UK capital. But Diana also has policy experience. She's worked as a policy advisor to 3 ministers of state for universities, science, research and innovation. And before this, she was the first Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Higher Education Policy Institute. Like Nick, she sees the election as an opportunity for higher education to position itself as part of the solution to national challenges. Hi, Diana. Thank you so much for joining us for the THE podcast.
Hi, Eliza, and thank you very much for the invitation.
I'm very excited to be speaking to you today in the lead up to the UK election. My first question for you was, what opportunities does an election actually present for higher education in terms of putting the sector on the national agenda?
That's a big question to get us going. Yeah, it was a shock election, wasn't it? But I think we've got to embrace the opportunity, as you say. And I do think it does provide a real chance for us as a sector to shape the narrative that we want out there. There's been a lot of negative talk in the UK at the moment about universities, about Mickey Mouse degrees, dare I say it. That's not the image that we want going out there. What we need to do is create our own slogans and our own buzzwords for ourselves, some positivity that will catch on, that we can get the nation's future policymakers talking about, that we can get the media using. And more importantly, what we need to do is paint ourselves as a solution to the national challenges that the policymakers are going to be elected to fix. So if you want to fix the NHS, well, I wonder who trains the doctors and the nurses. You know, if you want to change schools and the teachers' workforce, well, I wonder who trains the teachers. We need to make sure that we are there as a solution to the national challenges. So I think that we've got a real positive few weeks to try and do that.
Yeah, higher education certainly sits very much at the centre of everything that goes on, isn't it? And when you drill down into it, you really understand how absolutely interconnected it is. How much of an effect do you think a continuation of our current Conservative government or a change of government to Labor would make to the sector?
It's a good question. And I think a lot of people, regardless of what sector you're in, are looking for a change politically at the moment. And if the polls are right, it's coming. For our sector specifically, I think we've got to face reality that we are not high on the political agenda. Yes, we have a financial crisis in the sector. Yes, things are difficult. But actually, if you look at the list that any new government is going to inherit of things to fix, and I've mentioned a couple of them already, the NHS, schools, infrastructure, we are very low down on that list. And that's why I said before that we've got to paint ourselves as a solution to those issues in order to get our own issues heard, I think. So I think what will be positive is that we could probably expect a change of tone were the government to change. It would be a bit more positive and less hostility towards universities. But, nice words don't equate to money, and there's not going to be any new money in the bank. So really, the way we're going to get it is if we're part of that solution to the NHS, to schools, etc., etc. So yeah, there's a bit of positivity, but I don't think there's going to be much substance behind it. So a bit of a case of make, do, and mend, I think, for the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. We haven't heard yet from Labor about their manifesto. We had the Tories release theirs this morning, and the Liberal Democrats have also. One of the things that Rishi Sunak was talking about this morning was immigration, which is a key election topic and also a key issue for higher education in that it intersects with international student flows, enrolments and administrations. And changes in policy around visas can have an effect on those. Do you think that, what do you think are the possible outlooks for international students going forward post-election?
Yeah, this is the big topic at the moment. I do find it ironic that today's Tory party manifesto is actually quite positive towards immigration. There is a suggestion there about students maybe not being counted, maybe recognised as temporary migrants to the country and not being counted in overall migration statistics, which is something that the HE sector has been calling for a while. And had they come out with that a couple of months ago, when there was lots of fears that we would lose the graduate route in the UK, I think the sector would have felt a lot calmer. I think immigration is a hot topic for both political parties. The Labour Party too, just last weekend actually came out saying they're going to be a lot harsher on legal migration. Legal migration includes international students, and we do not have any detail on how the Labour Party, were they to get into government, will be tackling this issue. I think we should be mindful of the fact, though, that even a few months ago when we thought we'd lose the graduate route, the Labour Party did not come out in our defence. And that is something that we need to be mindful of, and we cannot forget. They haven't said any positive words about international students. So I think everything's to play for the future of international student migration. But I should say at London Higher, we are certainly putting international students recruitment front and centre. And tomorrow, actually, we will be relaunching Study London, which is a campaign not just to get students to London universities, but to get them to look at the UK above any other study destination in the world. If they look at London but choose to go elsewhere in the UK, then that is a win for brand Britain as well.
One of the other things that is talked about a lot in higher education in the UK is the funding issue with tuition fees, and also, I guess, folded into that, the cost of living. The Liberal Democrats said that they would review funding. I don't want you to gaze into your crystal ball, but I would like to get an idea about what sorts of areas you think would be useful to review.
I think the Liberal Democrats have hit the nail on the head, actually, with their pledge to increase maintenance loans for students. Because I think if we look at anything, it's all well and good having the best universities in the world and the best course provision out there and best choice, but it's no good if students cannot actually afford to see themselves through it. And maintenance levels have stagnated. When we had high inflation at 10%, they only rose by 2% of inflation. It's not making end meet. I think maintenance loans at the moment outside of London only cover 90%. Well, accommodation costs 90%. In London, it's more than that. So there's no wonder that students are having to take out part-time jobs. So we've got to get the maintenance picture right. I do think the current system in the UK is good to the extent that no matter your background or circumstance, you can access the means to go to university. You can cover your fees. But it's that maintenance part that has been eroded away, and that really needs to change if we're going to enable future generations of students to go. Again, at London Higher, our Access HE division, which is our widening participation arm, does have a piece of research coming out soon. And we've actually spoken to prospective students. And what we found is that the cost of living isn't turning them away from university, but what it is doing is making them consider university closer to home. And I guess it's reducing their excitement of going to university. There's a bit of apathy around it now. It's like, well, they have to do it. They have to do it to better themselves, but they're not as excited as they used to be when we did this research before. So that is a point of concern, actually. We've got to get the excitement back about the opportunities that students will have by going to higher education.
Mm. And where do you think, so another thing that was brought up this morning was apprenticeships. So where do you think sort of alternative qualifications, like things like shorter credentials, say micro credentials or stackable credentials, and apprenticeships fit into the landscape?
Yeah, I mean, this is the future of tertiary education. It's not just higher education, and I do think we're going to see a lot more talking tertiary as we go forward, because it's about creating those skills pathways throughout someone's lifetime, and that's maybe starting at further education, technical education, going right the way through what we call in the sector level 8 up to sort of research degrees. And of course, it doesn't have to be linear progression either. People change jobs throughout their lifetime. I've done it. I'm sure plenty more people will do it as technology evolves, as industries change. We're all going to need to upskill at some point. So I think there is a recognition that short courses, micro credentials will have to become part of that tertiary landscape. In terms of apprenticeships, though, I really don't think it should be an either or. I mean, not the full-time higher education model isn't for everybody. But what we shouldn't be doing is telling them it's not for everybody and siphoning them off into another direction. We live in a landscape of student choice, supposedly. That's why the Office for Students was created, for student choice. Apprenticeships is one part of that student choice matter. And all the talk at the moment in the Conservative manifesto about robbing Peter to pay Paul, taking Mickey Mouse degrees to pay away to pay for apprenticeships. It's not as easy as that. I mean, I can tell you now that I don't know how they're going to close down courses, but universities can create new ones. So that's not going to get rid of the problem, and it's certainly not going to fix the crux of the matter, and that is the demand for apprenticeships. At the moment, students by and large are voting with their feet. They are going to university. They still see that as the best option. What we need to do is enhance the attractiveness of apprenticeships, and pumping lots of money into it is not going to fix that overnight.
You mentioned earlier the campaign that you have to attract more students to London, and that this can also be a route through to other areas in the UK if that's where students choose to go, coming back to student choice as well. I know that you're based in London, so you may possibly have a biased approach to this question. But do you think in the UK, is there too much focus on the Golden Triangle, so London and the other corners, which are Oxford and Cambridge? Just in terms of widening participation, perhaps getting development, expertise, innovation out into other parts of the country?
Yeah, this has certainly been a big question over the past few years politically with the levelling up agenda. I think what I'd like to say first and foremost is that a lot of us in London who are advocating for London and doing policy work for London are not Londoners. I can tell from your accent you live here and you're not. I'm not. I was born on the Welsh border, actually. But what I do recognise is that makes me every inch a Londoner, because we are a global city. And having a strong capital is a benefit to the whole of the UK, and that's why we are pumping, using Brand London, pumping our money into a Study London campaign for the benefit of the whole country. We're not parochial here. It's not just about putting London above the other nations. We're not other regions. We're not against the other regions. We are with and for the other regions. Now, of course, it is really, really important to level up, to use that phrase, other parts of the UK. There should be lots of economic powerhouses in the Northwest, Northeast, Midlands, you name it. Every part of the country deserves that investment. And we've all got different industry strengths. I worked in the Midlands before I came to London. I know that automotive powerhouse, that's what needs building up there. In London, it's more likely to be the creative industries, something that hasn't had much love from the government. So we need to be having tailored approaches. But while we're doing that, we've got one big engine that works at the moment, and that is London and the Southeast. So let's use it. Let's power that engine up while we're powering the other engines up. It's not about doing one down to give to the other, because we'll all lose out for that. So yeah, it's a bit of a fudge of an answer, if you like, but I really do believe that everybody should have the investment, and we do have a showcase to the world. London is the gateway to the UK, particularly when we're competing internationally. So let's fly that flag, but let's do it for Brand Britain. It's not just about London.
Well, thank you for that. You've actually given me a very nice segue into my next question, so I should thank you for that as well, which is just that London is this international hub for finance, technology, absolutely the arts. Are there protections or policies that you would like to see under the next government term that would foster the city and its universities as a centre for international collaboration, to protect that, to encourage it, to build it even further?
I think what I'd love is, as I've said, London is an asset to the UK, wherever you're from. If we lose the appeal of London, it's not another UK city like Manchester or Birmingham that will win out. It's Sydney, it's Vancouver, it's other countries. And I love those cities too. But, we're all about brand UK today. So we need to keep London strong. So we really should be seeing our policymakers, the Mayor of London first and foremost, but also Westminster policymakers going out there and talking about London and attracting inward investment. And we haven't seen that recently because of the domestic policy. And I think a nervousness to be seen to be giving too much to London because it's all been about levelling up. But as I've said before, levelling up shouldn't mean taking away from London. It should be using London while levelling up. They're two different agendas. So we do need to be taking that sort of our business hats and going out and doing our international advocacy. That way we can attract the best talent that's out there, students, researchers, investors, business people, to come here and to build their businesses and to build their lives here. So I do think it really does centre around that sort of international campaigning and being proud to have London in our midst. Plenty other countries out there that would like a London.
For my final question, I would like to ask you to gaze into the crystal ball in a sense and ask what elements you think are going to shape the sector in the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think the Labour Party, even though we haven't seen their manifesto yet, they have their buzzword correct, and that is change. Change is going to shape the sector over the next few years. I think whatever happens, we're not going to see a quick fix overnight in terms of the sector finances or the shape and funding and regulation of the system. So if that all stays the same, something has got to give. So I think the sector that we will look at in 5 years' time will not be the same sector that we have now. We'll see consolidation of institutions. We'll see changing courses, both positively responding to industry needs, but also more negatively as well as funding gets constrained. So I think the sector of tomorrow will be different to the sector of today. And I think the biggest driver of that will be what's happening in technology and specifically artificial intelligence, AI. That is changed education over the past couple of years, certainly since the pandemic. It's being integrated into the way students learn. Again, many opportunities from it, but also some challenges that we need to grasp as well. And technology in the space is moving so quickly. So I think if anything changes the sector, it is going to be technology. And I don't know how it will change the sector, but we'll listen to this back in a few years' time and we'll go, oh my goodness, how quickly have things changed?
Well, that is a good place to end, I think. Thank you very much, Diana, for your time this morning. It's been terrific talking to you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
So I really found light on the horizon in Diana's challenge to this either-or approach to education when we talked about apprenticeships versus degrees or London versus the rest of the UK. This focus on student choice and strengthening the sector across the country I found incredibly positive, as well as her discussion on whether or not a new parliament might possibly look at maintenance funding to get university students to return some of the shine to that really valuable experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Diana's positivity is really powerful and something that perhaps others in the sector need to imbibe. So higher education leaders, if you're listening, this is your moment to make your case while politicians' ears are open, as it were. And we will be closely following all the political developments in relation to higher education across the Times Higher Education website. But if you want specific advice on how universities can play an active role in upholding democracy and training students to become engaged citizens, we have lots of resources and collections on this topic, contributed by experts across the sector here on campus. That's at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. Thanks very much.
We'll see you next time.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.